Well, welcome everyone to our very first webinar, a part of the Sustainable Webinar Series. The first webinar is Composting 101, How to Compost on and Off Campus. And then this presentation is brought to you today by our lovely Waste EcoRep team. And I hope you find it both educational, informative, and inspiring.
All right, y'all. So in case you just kind of have a general idea of what composting is, and if you're like me, you don't know exactly what it is, it's simply put, it's a way to turn scraps and organic waste into nutrients that can be reused immediately in a lot of ways. But composting is mainly on the plant side. It can be used from plants. Once the process, which I'll explain in a second, is completed, something called humus is produced, which is essentially just very, very rich and nutritious soil that can be used by both plants and animals in different ways, but the soil is mainly for the plants. It's truly, in my opinion, a fantastic way to reuse things that people would normally not think can be used again. Normally people would think it's just waste, and it's just thrown away. It should be thrown away, but it's very useful. But the chemical process that happens when composting is very fascinating, and here's how it works. Next slide, please. So the composting process basically involves two main compounds, which are carbon and nitrogen. Now, given this, there are certain types of materials that are required that maintain abundant amounts of these compounds. And in the composting sense, they're labeled as green materials and brown materials. Greens are very carbon-rich materials, and browns are very nitrogen-rich materials. Now, I know it seems a little weird at first with that kind of binary, but for me, I found an easy way to remember what kinds of materials are greens and browns is by remembering that since green is just a much lighter color than brown, it's a matter of, I guess, what is fresher than the other. So examples of that include like fresh live leaves and grass could be examples of some green materials, whereas dead or old grass or withered grass or dead leaves can be associated with the alternative. Now with composting, you want to kind of aim for a ratio of 2 to 1 with carbon-rich materials and nitrogen-rich materials. The ideal ratio is 2 to 1 because of the bacteria that thrive in it, and it's called thermophilic bacteria. Thermophilic bacteria is essentially just bacteria that really aids the composting process by producing heat that helps to speed up the process and break down the material. So that's essentially why the 2 to 1 ratio is recommended. It's not the end of the world if the ratio isn't followed to the letter. And I know that getting started with it, you'll probably encounter a little bit of difficulty at first with trying to maintain that ratio. But it just kind of makes things a little bit easier in the long run. But don't worry, there will be a cheat sheet on how to keep the ratio stable and how to, I guess, keep it, for the most part, solid later in the presentation. So how to make a composting container. There are a variety of ways to make composting containers. And since all of you have access to the guide that we're going through, there will be other ways, I guess, that require a little bit more maintenance, but they're arguably a little bit more effective. But the thing that we're going to go through right now is the cheapest way, the easiest do-it-yourself way, a way that literally anybody can do from their home, and that is the plastic container. Now there are there's pros and cons to every method, but for the plastic container, the pros include it's very contained and out of the way. So you get to just put it in a package separate from everything. It doesn't really spread that easily. It's very easy to start. Anybody can do this. You just get any plastic container and do it. And it's very easily transportable because with something like this, the nature of it will require you to regularly change out the compost, which is a good thing when you're considering other things that we'll get into right now. So obviously some of the cons include just limited space. It does require a small shovel or some tool similar to that to turn the corners because of the rounded nature of the bin, and a power drill in the beginning. And it does use plastic, so I guess that is a con, but in that sense, it's not single use. It's going to be it's going to be utilized very, very efficiently, and it's not going to be just thrown away. It's for a very good cause. So that is a con. But as far as the containers are concerned, remember the idea here is that we want heat heat is very important for the composting. So preferably dark, opaque plastic containers are recommended, preferably with snap-on handles, because again, we want everything to be really contained. We want everything to be really sealed, and just simply put, just solidified in itself, and that really helps. If you don't have snap-on handles, it's just a little bit harder for transportation and for sealing. So I would highly recommend that, but those are just widely abundant. Now, as far as the power drill is concerned with getting started, once you have the container, all you really need to do is just drill about 8 to 10 small holes on each side, including the lid. And you can do, for storage, you can do one of two things. You can leave it in a place with abundant sun, and you can leave it outside, or you could store it with the DIY version. You could store it in a little plastic container in your freezer. Either way works. The only issue potentially with storing it outside, particularly like at your front door, is just it has a potential to build up odor. If you have quite a bit of things in there and you're stacking a lot, you use a lot of compost, hopefully it may create a little bit of an odor. So I recommend if you're going to do it in your room, for example, if you're here at university and you have just a plastic container, I find that doing it in the freezer is a lot just more efficient. It just takes away the smell. It helps everything kind of stay put and not get real sludgy. And the last part that you need to remember with composting is that one of the most important parts is that it needs to be turned. And it's not as much maintenance as you would think. It's literally, if you're doing it with the small shovel and the plastic containers we talked about, you're going to try to aim to turn the compost every 3 to 7 days, more or less. It's, you know, that's just kind of the length of time to abide by. It's really not that hard. And when I'm saying turn, you just get the shovel, you get it all in the corners, and you basically just kind of mix it and just keep it from clumping onto itself. It causes all kinds of issues. It doesn't break down as easily. It doesn't break down as efficiently. But again, if you're talking 3 to 7 days, I mean, it's very doable. And yeah, that's, again, there will be other ways to, there will be other methods, other containers, other DIY methods, but for us, we highly recommend this method, especially if you're here on campus. If you're a student here in the apartments, there are the green composting bins. You can use that too. It's a little bit of a smaller kind of container. If you want a bigger container, I'd recommend just getting a bigger plastic one and then just doing it yourself, but you can use the composting bins here on campus as well.
Speaking of composting on campus, hi everyone, I'm Veronica, the Sustainability Coordinator. I just wanted to touch base real quick to let you guys know about the history of composting at Southwestern. Composting started in 2007 with an environmental studies capstone student, Aubrey Weeks, who wrote a plan to develop composting for the residential apartments. That same year, the university applied for a grant to purchase a compost bin for the commons, and also the facilities management, back then was known as physical plant, started a compost pile for yard waste next to the greenhouse. From 2009 to 2016, composting was alive and well in the commons. Southwestern had a partnership with Texas Disposal Systems, who's our waste hauler, to take our food waste and industrially compost it. The difference between industrial compost and regular compost is regular compost, you're doing it in your home, whereas industrial compost, they have a lot bigger volume and are able to manage some materials that can't be composted in your home garden more effectively, which I believe Nicole will get into more on the specifics on what can and cannot be composted later in the presentation. In 2012, there was a couple of compost investments. The Earth Tub, which is our compost digester next to the community garden, and the compost pedicab were purchased. Because of these two investments, SEEK had also created a system to collect compost from the commons for the community garden, in addition to the TDS contract. Unfortunately, in 2016, the TDS contract died. Not really sure what happened because that occurred prior to me getting here, but from what I've heard through Southwestern is it was just too much maintenance to keep up. there was a lot of smells and rodents and other critters that got attracted to the McCombs area, and that just ended up ending. And additionally, a lot of those Sikh students graduated, and so the initiative and drive to keep the Compost Bike alive and the compost program just more or less diminished. Fortunately, though, we have not a lot of excited students now. So in 2019, the EcoReps have revived the residential compost program, working with Seek and the Garden Club to issue the compost buckets. Just a little side note in regard to composting at Southwestern. Last summer in 2019, myself and an intern did a waste audit by collecting waste from SUPD, Robertson Center, and the Welcome Center. We collected the waste for a week and analyzed the waste by sorting out everything that was collected into certain types of recycling material, compost material, and trash. And what we found looking at the total waste stream was that nearly all of the waste, 30% of it was compostable. Only looking at the landfill waste, 40% of the material was organic, 36% was recyclable, which is pretty much means that we need to do better in regards to education and awareness and signage, because only 24% of what was in the landfill bins was actually trash. If we had a compost bin, that 40% would have been diverted from the landfill. I think Nicole's next.
All right, so now we're going to talk about what can and cannot go into compost. So to begin with, let's talk about what can almost always go into compost. I know the title's a little bit misleading, but to start with, remember what Sam said about how things are sorted into brown and green. So starting with the brown, that includes paper goods, so cardboard, old homework, cardboard boxes that food can come in. Just remember to always remove non-organic things like staples and the plastic on, say, envelopes or pasta boxes. And smaller things break down faster, so basically tear up boxes and paper goods as small as you have patience for. It doesn't really matter how small. Again, as small as you have patience for. Dry leaves can always go in. Do be sure that they're not molding and they don't have any fungus on them, because you don't want that in your compost. As for wood, try to only have small pieces. Big sticks can take a really long time, and especially if you only have a small bin, it really takes up space, and it's honestly just kind of annoying. But other types of wood that can go in are things like burnt matches, little pieces of wood chips, toothpicks, preferably that have not been in your mouth. We'll get into that in a minute. Dryer lint can also go in, surprisingly. And the thing about that is once it breaks down, you're gonna see some like shiny little thread-like fibers in your compost. That's okay. That's just plastic fiber from your clothing. It's not going to break down, and you can take them out if you want, but it's not hurting anything. It's really fine. And I do want to point out before I get to the green that this is all written down in a comprehensive composting guide that will be shared with you at the end of the presentation. You can find it online on the sustainability website, so don't worry about writing all of this down word for word. So going on to green things, lawn clippings are good. Do be careful that they don't have any pesticides or animal waste on them. For vegetable and fruit scraps, there are a couple exceptions to this, and we'll get to that in a minute, but generally everything is okay for vegetable and fruit. Toss it all in. Seeds are okay too. Weeds. You have to decide for yourself if you're okay with putting weeds into it, because there is the possibility that you toss them in, they spread their seeds, and then when you put down your compost in your garden or wherever you use it, they're going to sprout. If you don't mind, then go for it. If it's a hassle, then don't. It's really up to you. Hair is another weird one. Hair has a lot of nitrogen in it, and it's excellent for compost, as kind of gross as touching it can be. So you can pull it out of your brush, or you can put it in after you sweep up pet hair, that kind of thing. Sometimes if I haven't vacuumed up anything, you know, plastic or non-organic, I will just dump my entire vacuum bag into the compost bin, and it works great. So now we're going to move on to things that cannot go into compost. So germs, as I said before, you don't want like the toothpicks in your mouth or so on, or animal waste. Human and animal germs cannot go in the compost. And I think the best example of this is, remember when Chipotle had the cases of E. coli and infections a couple years ago? That was caused because the manure used to fertilize, or essentially compost, the lettuce and the parsley was infected, and then it got into the plants. So that's why you can't put like used tissues or animal waste in general into your compost bin. It can get into whatever you fertilize with it, and if you ingest it, it's bad. Chemicals, these can kill the life in your bin that is helping to break things down, which Anthony's going to get into later. But if you pour bleach into your compost bin, obviously all of the bugs are going to die, and you don't want that. Additionally, the chemicals can sit in it, and you get back into the germ issue of, if you use it to fertilize like a vegetable garden, the vegetables can absorb it essentially, and then you are eating it. So meats, eggs, and cheese are the classic example of things you can't put in your bin. They attract pests and they smell when they're breaking down, and it's going to be truly disgusting if you put those in there. Rice is a bit of an odd one, but it generally can attracts pests, and it's just not something that you should be putting in. Treated sawdust and wood. So the chemicals that are used to treat them is just like we talked about a minute ago. They can hurt the compost. Avoid putting any sawdust in unless you're sure it isn't treated. So basically, unless you have cut down the tree yourself and collected the sawdust, don't put it in. Additionally, something I found interesting about this is, if you mix pure sawdust into soil, nothing is going to grow there until it decomposes. And that's because sawdust is very high in carbon, which absorbs the nitrogen necessary for things to grow. So it's a great nutrient boost once it's decomposed, but until it does that, it's not going to let anything grow. So make sure it has decomposed completely before you use your compost. Walnuts are another really interesting one that I found while I was doing research for this. They actually contain a chemical called juglone that is toxic to some plants and vegetables like tomatoes. So if you have too many, and then you use your compost to fertilize a garden, it can kill off your plants. Fats and oils, so these attract pests and they smell, and creates a bad environment in your compost. And as the picture shows, you can kind of get around this with greasy things like pizza boxes by tearing off the parts that aren't greasy and tossing that in your compost, and then throwing away the greasy parts. Again, just remember to tear it up into smaller pieces so it breaks down faster. As for clothing and cloth, you cannot put that in because the dyes might be toxic, and they also just take an extremely long time to break down. Plus, a lot of the clothing that we wear now has plastic fibers woven into it, and obviously that won't break down properly. It'll break down, but not into what you want. If you have something that is 100% undyed cotton, then I suppose it could go in there, especially in like an industrial composter, but generally just don't. So, part one of things that can sometimes go in compost. A common theme for everything except for the cake bread crackers is that these are things that can change the pH of your compost. So coffee grounds, tea leaves, citrus peels, onion scraps, and fireplace ash are all things that make your compost more acidic. And as you can see from the little chart there, we want things to be neutral. Eggshells can make it more alkaline or basic, so higher up on the scale. And this can also be an excellent way to manipulate your soil once you use the compost as fertilizer. So for example, here in Georgetown, we have extremely basic soil, extremely basic, because we're sitting on a limestone deposit. So plants that like things a little bit more acidic, I can't think of any off the top of my head. I think tomatoes and citrus plants like it acidic, but they're not going to grow as well if you don't have soil that they like. So for our compost bin on campus here, for example, we love dumping in acidic things like coffee grounds, and it can really help sort of fix our soil. As for the cake bread and crackers, that is something that some compost containers can handle and others cannot. Here at Southwestern, it is perfectly okay to put in things like bread and crackers. Personally at home, I do not put them in my bin because animals like them, and so do ants. And cake is technically a little bit different. You really shouldn't put that in your bin because it's so sugary. You're going to get ants. You do not want ants. Now for other things that can sometimes go in compost. Compostable plastic is a tricky one. Basically, on campus, you can think of the little compostable cups that we have in the Cove. Those are technically compostable. We try not to put too many in the compost digester because they take a while to break down, so they can quickly overwhelm things and kind of clog it up, and then we can't use it while we wait for it to break down. Also, things are mislabeled very frequently. Perhaps mislabeled is the wrong word, but companies greenwash and try to make you think that their plastics are better for the environment than they actually are. So as my little picture here says, remember that bio-based plastics are plastics that are made at least partially from biological matter. So they're not fully plant-based necessarily. And biodegradable plastics are plastics that can completely be broken down by microbes in a reasonable time frame. But remember that, again, things can quickly overwhelm your compost if you put too many of them. So if you use a lot of biodegradable plastics, it's going to sit there for a long time. Industrial composters can handle that a lot better. So if you live in a place where you can send your compost to be taken off and dealt with by the city, then it's a little bit better. But here on campus and at home, it's better not to use them. As the same kind of goes for compostable cleaning supplies like these Clorox wipes. So you should always follow the instructions that are on the package. It should say something like, this should not make up more than X% of household compost. A few of them getting tossed in our SU bin is fine. Really try not to. So as for waxy paper, I mean things like shiny magazines. If you do put it in, rip it up very small before putting it in because the soy wax takes a while to break down. But generally also, while we're talking about magazines, try to avoid having too much inked paper in your bin. It's just not very good for it. So now that you have things in your compost bin, how do we take care of it? So always remember the goal. So the dark soil on the right is darker. It looks more crumbly than the one on the right. The one on the right looks almost like a sandy texture. The one on the right as well looks a little bit damp, like it clumps kind of nicely. You want it to smell earthy, like really nice soil that you just maybe got out of like a bag from Home Depot. The goal is always, you are producing soil, you are not producing garbage sludge. So remember that. As for keeping it neutral, there are really simple pH tests you can do at home. I know we're college students and we don't want to purchase expensive pH tests from the pool store. I, to be honest, don't even know where you would get one. You can go back to elementary school science class for this one. Again, this is all in the guide, so I'll try not to go too in depth. But you can basically do a little at-home science experiment by mixing some of your compost with water in 2 separate cups. And then you add vinegar to 1 cup and baking soda to the other cup, and whichever one fizzes tells you what it is. Because if your soil is really acidic and you add baking soda to it, it's going to fizz, just like those like elementary school volcanoes. And it's a good, like not super accurate, but still good gauge for at-home composting. So troubleshooting. This is probably what you'll have the most questions on if you're doing this at home. You don't have to worry about it at SU here because other people will take care of it. But at home, if your compost is too wet, like you can visibly see water in it, or it's starting to get like heavy and like hard packed, you just need to add dry papery goods like newspaper or cardboard. If it is too dry, it should be damp to the touch, kind of like a damp sponge. So you can add a little bit of water sometimes just for fun. I like to add water that I cooked like pasta or vegetables in just for a little extra nutrients. If it's too acidic, you can remember what we talked about earlier, and you can add eggshells or if you have access to them, maybe you live in the Gulf, oyster shells, always grind those up because they take a really long time to break down. So I like to wait for them to dry out, and then I'll put them in like a food processor and put the powder into my compost bin. If it's too basic, you can add things like coffee grounds, tea leaves, onions, or citrus scraps, that kind of thing. Ants are another common problem, especially since we live in the South. No one wants fire ants in their backyard. You can stir everything up really well, because if you break up their home too many times, they will not come back. You can also let your compost get really hot. Make sure you have a black container, put the lid on really tight, let it sit out in the sun, especially if it's summer, it'll get hot, and they don't like that. They will leave. Smelling like garbage is probably the most common problem. Your compost should not smell. I cannot emphasize this enough. It should not smell. If it does, you have added too many vegetable scraps, and you need brown stuff. So like newspaper or cardboard, again, like if it's too wet. It will not fix itself immediately. You need to give it about a week for the browns to actually like absorb and break down and all that, but it should be better. The last one's not technically a problem, but it is annoying. I don't like opening the lid and having lots of little gnats and flies swarm out in my face. It's gross, and I like bugs. But that generally means that you just have food scraps pretty close to the surface, and they should do that less if you put a nice layer of brown stuff, again, newspaper, cardboard, on top of it.
Hello everybody, my name is Anthony Garcia, and this slide is basically just over like the types of critters that you should be able to, or that will most likely pop up in your compost bin. First up, we got the slugs, which are really helpful, but if you don't really like slugs too much, or if you feel like there's too many, you can always add in some coffee grounds, and they should just leave fairly soon. Next up, we have isopods, which are more commonly known as wood lice or pill bugs. Again, these guys are very common and really helpful, really no problem at all. Next up, we have fruit flies, which although can be really annoying, again, really helpful with composting. And black soldier flies, they look like wasps and they can look very intimidating, but they're really harmless. They don't really have any mouths either, so not gonna bite you, not gonna sting. Next up, we have maggots and grubs. Both these guys look, just being frank, they look really gross and really disgusting, but they really help out with composting and really just breaking down the organic materials in your compost bin. Next up, we have worms, which the ultimate composter, really fantastic. So they're just really fine in your compost bin. And then ants, like Nicole said, they're helpful, but many times fire ants also move in and they can kill worms, which we don't really want. So you can just stir up the pile and they should leave. Like Nicole said, after a few times, they should just get going. And then roaches, not a problem, but they also fall into the gross category. So if there's too many in your compost bin, you just stir the pile and then just make it a little bit wet. And then once they're out of there, you just like add in some napkins and like other like dry compostables, and you should be good. And then next up, we have the food recovery hierarchy issued by the EPA to address food waste. Number one on the list is source reduction, which is basically just kind of like reducing the amount of food you eat from, and like in this scenario, it'd be like from the commons. Instead of getting like 3 plates in one go, maybe just like 1 plate, and then going back for extras if you like want more food. Next up, it's feed the hungry people. Normally, you'd see this through donating extra food to food banks, soup kitchens, and shelters. Now, we're the waste department of the EcoReps, but if you do want to get in touch with the food department, we can drop some emails after the PowerPoint. And then next up is feed the animals, which I will go more in depth in just a little bit. And then next up, we have food waste for energy. This is normally what you'd see in ethanol, and just kind of like just using biofuel to fuel really any machinery. And then next up, it's composting, which it's really great for just creating just nutrient-rich soil to help your garden grow and whatnot. And then last resort, we really don't want this to happen. It's landfills. But yeah, and then circling back to the food and to like feeding the animals and whatnot, we're hoping to partner with Grub Tubs, which is an organization that turns food scraps into animal feed. So, you know, yeah.
All right, so now we're going to get back into composting at Southwestern. So this is a picture of the digester. It is in the garden. It is what Veronica talked about earlier that we got funds for to really kind of step up our composting game. So you can see on top, there's that little hatch. That is where it opens and we can just dump the compost in. You can also see to the right of it, it might be a little bit hard to see, but there's kind of a handle sticking out. That's how we turn it. It takes 3 people who are very strong, but you push on it real hard and it turns this, how do I say it? Pretty much like a big stick inside, and it rotates everything and lets it get all aerated. So what this has to do with students who maybe aren't taking care of the compost, those green bins on top are what you can take for free and put your compost in. When it is full, you bring it back and you put it on the ground where that white bucket is, and you can take a clean one. You don't have to put the compost in the bin or anything. We will take care of it all for you. So just leave it and take a clean one, and that's basically all. Additionally, for easy composting at Southwestern, what my roommate and I personally do is, instead of these green bins, because they can smell if you don't take them out frequently enough, we use the like plastic containers that say like spinach comes in, and we keep our compost in there and we leave that in the freezer until we're ready to take it out to the garden. And freezing it keeps it from breaking down so it doesn't smell. And then we can just toss it into the bin and it unfreezes, starts breaking down, and it works great. So you can really do either of them. And if you want to talk about your options, our emails are at the end of this PowerPoint. So if you want to like get in contact, also we're going to have question time. So whichever way is fine for you. Here's a picture of the compost bike that Veronica talked about earlier again. So we're hoping to revive it. And this year we have a plan that we hope we can park it outside of McCombs or maybe the Cove 1 day a week for a couple hours. And instead of walking to the garden, which can be really far, especially live in the first year dorms, you can just walk to McCombs, leave your compost bin, and take a clean one and be on your way. And you don't have to come to the garden. Although it is really nice, it is kind of far. And we are additionally looking for volunteers to come help drive it if you are interested in that. You can just email me about it. All right, so that concludes our presentation. Here are our emails if you want to get in contact more personally with any of us. Mine's the first one. Anthony is Garcia34 and Sam is Raymond J. And we are going to open up questions. Ask anything, no stupid questions. I know this can be really complicated at first, so go ahead.
Well, it looks like we have one already. The first question is, so the main things you put in the compost are carbohydrate-rich products, question mark.
So not really. Carbohydrate-rich products they tend to attract bugs like ants and also animals. So generally we try to stick to primarily having like vegetable scraps and fruit scraps and paper goods. As I said earlier, things like bread are okay in some composters, some can't really take them at all. But again, generally vegetable, fruit scraps, and newspaper.
The next question is, will we have access to this PowerPoint? Yeah, I am more than happy to send it out afterwards to all the people who have signed up and registered, along with the video recording of this and the compost guide that has been referenced many times throughout the presentation.
Additionally, if you don't get that, or if you want to send this to somebody who's maybe like not even at the school, like your parents, the composting guide is on the Southwestern website. I believe it's under sustainability and then under zero waste.
It will be. It isn't there yet.
And also, I'm not sure if we said this, but the guide has everything we've said nearly word for word. So don't worry if you miss something.
If anybody has any other questions, we're here. Email us. Everybody will have access to the guide. It's all in there. So email us with any other questions that you may have.
Yes, thank you guys for coming to our first webinar.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.